This is Edinburgh, the cultural and political capital of Scotland. Many visit Edinburgh to enjoy its historic old town and hilltop castle, but few consider why it's located here or what lies beneath the stronghold. To understand how this city came to be, we must start during the Ice Age of the early Carboniferous period, 350 million years ago, when a great channel of magma burst through the surrounding sediment. This magma cooled into a tall underground pipe of crystalline rock known as dolerite. As we emerged from that ice age, glacial erosion from west of the volcanic pipe cut away the majority of the surrounding sedimentary rock, but the rigid dolerite protected the softer rock to its east, creating a single gradual slope to the peak of the rock, with steep cliffs on its other 3 sides. Called a crag and tail formation, this natural fortress provided some obvious defensive advantages, although it also presented some drawbacks, as we'll discuss a little later in the video. The first humans arrived in the area which is now Edinburgh around 8500 BC, and the rock itself is believed to have been settled in the late Bronze or early Iron Age, which may make it the longest continually occupied site in Scotland. Romans arrived in the 1st century AD and set up a fort in the area, and Ptolemy's 2nd century map shows a nearby settlement called Alana, or Rock Place, which may be the first known name of the rock. In the following centuries, the Gododdin tribe built a hill fort known as Din Aden in the area, which is believed to have been on the rock and is the source of the name Edinburgh, meaning Aden Fort. According to a Welsh poem of the time, the Gododdin king, Mynydog Mynfar, spent a year with his warriors, feasting in Din Aden, before riding south to Yorkshire to battle with the Angles. While they were ultimately massacred, the poem regales the tale of their valor and glory, and ignited the proud warrior spirit that the Scottish remain famous for. After the defeat of the Gododdin in the 7th century, Din Aden and the surrounding territory were overtaken by the Kingdom of Northumbria, and remained under Northumbrian rule for the next 3 centuries, at which time the fort was annexed into the Kingdom of Scotland. The Kingdom of Scotland continued to grow in the 8th and 9th century, and formed a primary seat of power in the township of Scone, which served as the first capital of Scotland. 2 centuries later, back in Edinburgh, the rock finally attained its current use, supporting the famous Edinburgh Castle. King Malcolm III Canmore began fortifications on the slope below the rock and built a chapel for his wife Margaret, which is considered by many to be the oldest surviving building in Edinburgh. But it was Canmore's son, King David I, who truly established Edinburgh as a seat of royal power. King David held political assemblies of nobles and churchmen at the castle, and allocated strips of land, known as tofts, to merchants along the market street below, now known as the Royal Mile. Each toft stretched back from the street and formed a private close, or enclosed yard. While these properties have since been greatly subdivided, the narrow streets between them are still referred to as closes, as a nod to this era of history. It's said that while King David was out hunting in the forests east of Edinburgh, he was thrown from his horse after it was startled by a stag. The king was then charged by the animal, but was saved at the last moment by the light of a crucifix reflecting into its eyes. In gratitude for this divine intervention, King David founded St. Giles' Church along the market street and built a monastery at the end of the road called the Abbey of Holyrood, referring to the Holy Cross. Edinburgh remained at peace throughout the following century until 1174, when King William the Lion was captured by the English at the Battle of Alnwick, and was forced to surrender Edinburgh Castle and 3 other fortresses to the English king, Henry II. The castle remained in English occupation for 12 years, until it was returned to King William as the dowry of his English bride. After another century of peace, during which a stone castle was built in the Scottish capital of Scone, Competing claims for the kingdom arose in 1286, when the heir to the throne died before she could be crowned. Edward I of England was sent to help resolve the matter, but instead he complicated things further by taking advantage of the opportunity to establish himself as the feudal overlord of Scotland. He laid siege to Edinburgh Castle, which was surrendered to England after a 3-day bombardment. King Edward had many of the Scottish legal records and royal treasures moved to England, and installed a large garrison in the castle. After his death, however, England's control over Scotland weakened, and in 1314, a group of 30 Scottish men scaled the castle's north wall under cover of darkness and ambushed the garrison. After the castle was retaken, royal contender Robert the Bruce purposefully damaged it to prevent reoccupation of the English, and 4 months later led an army that secured victory at the Battle of Bannockburn, often called the last great Scottish victory. After Robert the Bruce's death in 1329, English forces retook and refortified Edinburgh Castle, but Scotland wasn't willing to give up their victory that easily. This time, the Scottish assault was led by Lord William Douglas, who disguised his party as merchants bringing supplies to the garrison. They drove a cart to the entrance and halted it there to prevent the gates from closing, while a larger hidden force rushed in to slaughter the Englishmen who held the garrison and retake the castle once again. The 14th and 15th century saw further expansion of the castle, with the completion of David's Tower on the site of the present Half Moon Battery in the 1370s, and the Crown Square being laid out over vaults in the 1430s, followed by royal apartments and the current approach road in the following decades. The armament of the castle increased in this time period as well, with the first gun purchased in 1384, and the famous Great Bombard Mons Meg gifted to the king in 1457. One of the largest cannons in the world, Mons Meg weighs 7 tons, and when in use, took 150 pounds of gunpowder to fire a 300-pound stone cannonball over 1.5 miles. As the Edinburgh Castle and city continued to expand, the medieval capital in Scone was languishing, lacking the population, prosperity, and scientific and theological merit of Edinburgh at the time. In 1437, the capital of Scotland was moved to Edinburgh, where it has remained due to its history and prominence, even as Glasgow has surpassed it in size. In 1479, the Duke of Albany, Alexander Stewart, was caught plotting against his brother, King James III, and was imprisoned in David's Tower. Stewart escaped by getting the guards drunk and lowering himself from a window on a rope. He fled to England, where he allied himself with the king and rode back to Scotland with an English army, whereupon he imprisoned his brother in the castle and gave him a taste of his own medicine. After a few months of this reversal, King James negotiated a settlement, and the castle returned to Scottish control. His son, King James IV, continued work on the castle by building the Great Hall, but found that he preferred staying elsewhere in times of peace, and built the Palace of Holyrood House by the Holyrood Abbey as his principal Edinburgh residence. Holyrood House remains the chosen meeting point of British royalty in Edinburgh to this day, although it is normally open to public tours. King James IV was killed in a battle with the English in 1513, and to avoid another English takeover of Edinburgh, the Scots swiftly constructed a town wall around Edinburgh and bolstered the castle's defenses, which were mostly successful at keeping the following English invasions from the city. However, Scotland found itself in internal turmoil in the later part of the century, after the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, was forced to abdicate her crown by Protestant nobility. James Stewart, Earl of Moray, took power for a few years as a regent in the name of Mary's infant son, James VI, appointing Sir William Kirkcaldy of Grange as keeper of the castle. However, Regent Moray was murdered by a supporter of Queen Mary in 1570, and following his death, Grange turned on the King Regent and took over the castle in the name of Queen Mary. This led to a 2-year standoff for ownership of the castle, which came to be known as the Lang Siege, Lang being the Scottish word for long. The king's men were struggling to maintain such a long siege, but the castle rock was found to have a major drawback. Its dense dolerite geology made for a very poor aquifer, and the deep well still proved insufficient. Ultimately, Grange's party had to concede to a truce, surrendering the town back to the king, with Grange confined to the castle. However, upon expiration of the truce, Grange turned on the king once again, and began bombarding the town with the castle's guns. In retaliation, the king's men, now led by Regent Morton, dug trenches around the castle and poisoned the well. Queen Mary's other supporters surrendered to the King Regent over the following month, but Grange refused to capitulate, instead continuing to bombard the town and set fires throughout Edinburgh. Grange's bombardment continued for the following months, until the English invaded Edinburgh once again and began bombarding the castle themselves. They destroyed the south wall of David's Tower and the Constable's Tower, blocked access to the castle entrance and forewell, and then overtook the outer fortification known as the Spur. Grange still resolved to continue his resistance, but his men threatened a mutiny, so he chose to surrender to the English rather than to the Scottish King Regent. However, the English gave Edinburgh Castle back to the Regent, giving power back to the Scottish king. Queen Mary was later tried and executed for plots against the English Queen, Elizabeth I. With power finally back with the king, Regent Morton set about rebuilding the damaged castle, fixing the spur and creating the new half-moon battery and portcullis gate. The castle began shifting focus around this time as well, with its primary use as a garrison fortress, while royalty continued to prefer nearby Holyrood House. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Edinburgh Castle was besieged a few more times, with mixed success, with its last military action being to quell Bonnie Prince Charlie's Jacobite blockade in 1745. Between the castle and the palace, St. Giles Church had become Scotland's most famous religious building, having been transformed from its former Romanesque architecture to the current Gothic cathedral, and pivotal in the Scottish debate whether to stick with the Roman Catholic ideology or break away with the Protestant movement. Central to the latter movement was John Knox, the 16th century reformer and founder of Scottish Presbyterianism. After being elected minister of St. Giles, Knox began purging the Roman Catholic furnishings, whitewashing the walls, and smashing the stained glass. Perhaps Knox's most notable influence was in his insistence that every citizen be able to read God's Word, which gave Scotland an education system centuries ahead of the rest of Europe at the time. Despite this educational advantage, these centuries were not easy on much of Edinburgh's populace. Along with being subject to multiple raids while the royalty hid in their fortresses, Edinburgh was becoming increasingly crowded, with narrow buildings 10 stories or higher built up along High Street, and many of the poorer classes living in darkness and filth. Many contemporaries considered the city the most congested in Europe of the time, and it became known as Old Reekie, as it was a mess of chimneys and reeked of smoke. Alongside this squalor, Edinburgh saw great expansion of the arts and sciences in the 1700s, known as its Enlightenment age. 1726 saw the addition of a faculty of medicine to the 16th century University of Edinburgh, followed by the introduction of the Edinburgh Music Society 2 years later, for which the city remains famous. Edinburgh also saw many international visitors in this decade, including American intellectual Benjamin Franklin, who wrote following his visit that for scientific prowess, no place in the world can pretend to a competition with Edinburgh. In 1771, the first edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica was published in Edinburgh, and by 1810 it had been expanded from 3 to 20 volumes. In 1820, the city began to be called Athens of the North because of the similarities in topography, architecture, and intellectualism. Edinburgh Castle continued to be used in the 18th and 19th centuries as a war prison, with new buildings being erected for the garrison, including the Governor's House in 1742 and the new barracks in 1796. However, a mass prison break through a hole in the south wall in 1811 convinced authorities that the castle vaults were no longer suitable as a prison. The castle began to gradually assume its current role of national monument. In 1818, historian Sir Walter Scott was given permission to search the castle for the Crown of Scotland, which hadn't been seen since the union of Scotland and England in 1707. By breaking into a sealed room, now known as the Crown Room, and unlocking a chest inside, Scott rediscovered the honours of Scotland, which were then put on public display for a viewing cost of 1 shilling. 1861 saw the addition of the 1 o'clock gun, which is fired at precisely 1 p.m. each day to give the ships something to set their clocks by. It once saw military use during the First World War, when it was fired at a German Zeppelin during an air raid. Aside from this time gun, a few building restorations, the addition of the Argyle Tower over the Portcullis Gate, and the tribute of the Scottish War Memorial, the experience of visiting the monument has changed very little in the century and a half since its opening. Strolling through Edinburgh today, it's clear to see the effect the castle and underlying rock had on the city. Edinburgh Castle remains Scotland's most popular tourist attraction, and the Royal Mile along the Old Market Street still draws crowds to its ancient high-rises, now turned to museums and kitschy souvenir shops. It's a place where artists and writers are inspired, and where musicians and performers fill the streets with Scottish spirit.
Iranian, Yakdo say, Arabic, Wahed and the Lather, Romans, aye.
As I strolled down these walkways and closes, marveling at the architecture and vibrancy of the city, I couldn't help but wonder if this magical place would be any different from the surrounding grassy hills if it weren't for that tube of magma happening to bubble up right where I was standing all those millennia ago.